Hey everybody, it's Kevin with Horology Project. Another unboxing review video for you today. Today we have a really special diver's watch. As you'll notice from the box here, it's a Seiko's 55th anniversary Seiko's diver's watch. So this year, 2020, marks the anniversary year for Seiko's divers. So Seiko's been releasing several limited editions in a special blue usually, to mark the anniversary of this year. And this was kind of the first of it to kick it off, and probably the most well received and loved piece. That is the 55th anniversary SPB149J. And as we see in the unboxing, here she is. Isn't she a beautiful watch? Now, when you think of dive watches, of course, one brand comes to mind, and that being Rolex. The Rolex Submariner in particular is one of the dive watches that have really popularized all dive watches, and for good reason. It's a really iconic design, although sometimes debated on who really originated that style, whether it was Blancpain or with their 55 fathoms, or the Rolex Submariner. But needless to say, Rolex has kind of eclipsed most brands when it comes to their dive watches. And really, there are a few brands out there that have as much heritage as the Submariner when it comes to a diver's watch. However, there are a few watches out there that are pretty unique, and at least were in the first stages of dive watches that were released. One is the 55 fathoms, which I had already just mentioned. The other is the Omega Seamaster 300, and perhaps one of the others is Seiko 62 Mass that was released in 1962. So this watch right here, if I'm not mistaken, pays homage to the 62 Mass. Or I guess it might have been released in a different year, right? Because if you do the math, then 55 years should be a little later than that. But this pays direct homage to the 62 Mass or Mass, and it does it really well. In a world where dive watches and most watches in general have been getting bigger and bigger and bigger, this watch shows a lot of restraint. And that makes me really happy, especially with Seiko divers, since so many of Seiko's watches have gotten larger and larger and larger. And as we'll talk about in a minute here, this watch really nails vintage proportions and aesthetics with still giving it some modern flair. So with that being said, let's go ahead and measure this watch. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about it and give you my impressions of this watch as an owner for about a month's time now. So one of the most two important dimensions that people typically care about is how wide the watch is. And it is exactly 40.5 millimeters. But something worth noticing or mentioning is if there's any difference between what the bezel is and what the actual case thickness is. So if across the bezel is a little bit shorter than what it is in the width of the case. But it still works out okay. The reason why I mention that is because certain watches, like 5-digit Submariners and older, if I'm not mistaken, definitely the 5-digit Submariners, there's a little bit of bezel overhang over the watch. And it's really convenient because it allows you to grip it even better since it's not flush to the watch. So for instance, I owned a Tudor Black Bay 58 and some of the other older Tudor or Black Bay lineup, and those are completely flush with the watch, which makes it kind of difficult to be able to turn at times because you're kind of gripping both the side of the watch and the coin edge bezel at the same time. Let's look at the next measurement now. This is lug to lug, and we have a lug to lug on this watch of roughly 47 millimeters or so. So about I'm getting closer to 47, but I think somewhere it says it's 47.5. So depending on exactly where you grip it, it's around 47 millimeters. And then the lug width is a beautiful 20 millimeters. And last but not least, the thickness of the watch is at about 13.5, 13.6 millimeters. Let me put that in better view for you guys. So depending on where I grip it from, it's high 13s, pushing 14 millimeters thick, which is not, it's still acceptable within the diver's world, but definitely a little bit on the chunkier side compared to some other watches out there. So let me go ahead and just talk about what I think about and what I feel about this watch. I think this is a great addition to the Seiko lineup. It's a really, really nice piece. I'm digging the dial so much on this watch, and it's hard to really show it in camera, but that dial just plays so well. I think, here we go, I'm capturing it under a better light right now. That dial just plays so well. If I were to describe the color of it, it's definitely blue, but there are notes of gray in it. And it is more of a sunburst type dial, but I think they gave it a bit of a more matte finish. So the sunburst isn't as strong as it would be on an Alpinist, if you've ever owned an Alpinist or a Hulk. So it's really subtle, but still plays with light in such a beautiful way. And I remember watching the original renderings for this watch, and the gold hand looked so much more noticeable, to where I was kind of off-put by it, or at least at the very least uncertain by it. But in person, I could tell you that it's very subtle. It looks a little bit more yellow in the renders, but it actually matches pretty well to the font on the dial. Overall, I would say that the proportions and the dimensions of this watch are pretty much perfect. It's not too big for most people, not too large. So myself, I am on the skinnier side of things when it comes to my wrist. So for example, I'm wearing my first Swiss watch I ever purchased, my vintage Omega Seamaster from the 1960s, which is about 36.5 millimeters wide. And so I definitely have a preference for smaller watches because I only have about a 6.5 inch wrist. Well, this watch is going to look great on your wrist, even if you have a smaller wrist. And if you have a larger wrist, it'll still look really nice. So let me show you what that looks like. So as I said, it looks great, doesn't it? What a beautiful piece. You know, I think having owned the Black Bay 58 in the past, I think this really, really is a good alternative if you are not interested in paying $4 grand for a watch, but still want something with just as much heritage and legacy, with a classic design that's original to the company. And in fact, I would actually argue that there's certain things about this watch that are even better than the Black Bay 58 at nearly a third of the price range. Although it is worth noting that this particular watch right here had 5500 limited edition issues, which sounds like a big number, but in the world of Seiko, with such an international market, these are going to be hard to come by, just because 5500 is not a huge number if you factor in how big of a market Seiko has around the world. So I don't know how many authorized dealers Seiko has worldwide, but let's say they have at least 500 authorized dealers. And that means, and who knows if it's more, that means that each one of those dealers might be getting 10 pieces. So if you spread that across the world, that just kind of shows you how difficult it'll be to get these. So for instance, I think the AD that I got it from in Denver, which there's only one AD out here in Denver. I think they had 2 of these altogether from when they were initially launched. So I think I got the second one. But talking a little bit more about the ownership of the watch, I'll talk a little bit about just what I love and maybe what I don't love about this watch. Seiko put in a new movement in here, and it is this, if I remember correctly, the 6R35 movement, which is a continuation, if you will, of the 6R15 movement that I believe you would find in the older Alpinists and the older Turtles. Really good movement from Seiko for the most part. Robust, reliable, and something neat that these new movements, the R35s, have is they actually have a 70-hour power reserve, which is a lot of time, and the same exact power reserve amount as a Black Bay 58. Although this is beating at a lower rate, so I think it's around 2100 or 21,000 an hour versus like the Black Bay 58s being 28,000 an hour. But overall, really, really nice sweep. So I really like the cleanness of the dial. So I already mentioned the colors of the sunburst, but I actually like the restraint with the texts. They let you know that it's an ISO certified divers 200-meter watch. Very nice font text for the date. They did it tastefully in a way that I think still offers a good amount of symmetry with having a date. And a printed logo is my preference, because when you have applied logos, depending on the light, they can kind of fade away in an ugly way and disappear. But the applied indices and just the overall finishing of the watch is really nice. I think the hands are beautiful. They have a brushed finishing that likes to play with the light. And so do the indices themselves. The loom on this thing is a total beast and works fantastic. While I like this 6R35 movement, and there's not many watches out there in the sub $2,000, let alone sub $1,000 price range that you can find that have a fully in-house movement like this Seiko does, I think that they need to rethink what kinds of movements they put in their watches that are above $1,000. So while I think the 6R35 movement has a lot of things to like about it, I do criticize it because mine runs a little bit all over the place is probably the wrong word, but I feel like the deviation that it has is too much. So like some days, for instance, it's +9, some days it's +12, some days it's, +3, and that's not bad in the grand scheme of things, and it's averaging out to like, +9 seconds or so, but it's not consistent. At least some other watches that I have, even with the older 2824 movement in them, they'll run consistently. If I'm wearing them regularly and, just kind of in the same rhythm, they'll run consistently around +3, +4, +1 a day. But it's more consistent. This one, I have no idea whether it's going to be +9, +12, +3. And that really bugs me because I feel like if I'm paying, which this watch MSRP'd for $1,350, if I'm paying $1,350 for a watch, then I think they need to put a better movement in it that offers a little bit more reliability. And when you actually think about what these 6R35s are rated for, Seiko allows for there to be a considerable amount of deviation within the watch, even though, typically they run okay. That really bugs me about this watch. And I think they should consider using the 6L movement series in here, even though they have been putting those in the more expensive watches. But I think if you're getting to $1,000, you really should be getting something that is a little bit more robust than this 6R35. However, it is a Seiko, and while this movement hasn't been fully tested through years and years and years of use, we can assume that since it's based off the architecture of the 6R15, that's going to last you a while, as so many Seiko movements are known for. Outside of that, that's probably one of my biggest complaints of this watch. It's fantastic. You know, I do wish it was probably a millimeter thinner. And specifically right here, you see how there's a gap between the actual case and the beginning of the coin edge bezel. While this allows for a very grippy feel of the bezel itself, which, by the way, the bezel turns amazingly. I do wish it was a little bit closer to the case, giving it a slimmer profile. But overall, I think it wears really well despite being closer to 14 millimeters. So, example, the Pelagos and the Tudor Black Bays, not the 58, but the standard Black Bay divers, are around the same thickness, but I feel like this wears much better and much thinner to the wrist because it's not so slab-sided and it curves really well. So take a note of these nice curves right here. That means it's going to hug your wrist really, really nicely, and it does so on mine. Another thing that I love about this watch is the use of solid end links on a wonderful size 20 millimeter. So unlike some of the other Seiko watches like the SKX 007, which we all love, this just hits perfect. 40.5 millimeters, 20 millimeter lug width, 47 millimeter lug tip to lug tip. I mean, it's just like, it's firing on all cylinders when it comes to that. And I love the fact that they used these very meaty, solid end links. And I think it's solid center links from what it feels like. Bracelet, that's this oyster style bracelet with a subtle taper to about 18 millimeters at the bottom of this clasp. They do put this DiaShield coating on the watch, and you can kind of feel it. And it does work pretty well. This has pretty much stayed almost scratch-free because of that shield coating, which I think, you know, you can check the numbers online, but it basically offers probably twice the scratch resistance than your standard stainless steel, which is pretty neat from it. So yeah, overall, I think this is a fantastic watch, and I'll just go ahead and throw it on the wrist again for you. I think it wears just like I said earlier. Beautiful. The bezel on this thing is 120 click bezel. And you know, if you are wanting to spend more money on a diver, but maybe you're having a hard time getting a Black Bay 58 or spending that kind of money on it, but you still want a watch that's vintage in style with some heritage, you should really consider this watch. You know, one of the things that I wish they would come out with in Tudor's lineup is a date window for the Black Bay 58s. This has it. I don't like how Tudor has, for instance, I don't like how Tudor has a 60 click bezel. This one has a dialed in, beautiful 120 click bezel, and it turns great. This is honestly, in this price category, this is one of the best bezel turning I've ever had in a watch. I mean, it's just that good. Beautiful profile, great finishing on it. I'm really impressed actually with the finishing. Love that unique chamfering style that they did, the way it curves on the wrist. And the known crown guards too are really, really fun on this watch. My last bit of criticism though is at this clasp. I'd love for it to be a quick set micro adjust clasp. I am thankful that there is micro adjustment here, but I'd love for there to be a quick set one. But I could live without it. What does bother me the most about this clasp is not that it has a milled portion, because this is really solid and the folding feature is also really solid. But I hate this clasp on any one of Seiko's watches because I hate this stupid diver's extension that they add. And I think they have a very similar one on the mini turtle, on some of the newer turtles, and they're using this stupid diver's extension. And I can't tell you enough how much I hate this stupid thing. And I know I'm probably like too passionate about this, but we're watch people and we're all passionate about random watch stuff, right? But I hate it because I think it disrupts the flow of the bracelet, and I don't like that. So like, I don't like seeing that there. It just really disrupts the flow of the bracelet, and I just want to see it elegantly taper into the middle of my wrist versus the side of my wrist into this weird clasp. The diver's extension on it in itself is kind of clunky in its use, so you have to like pull this thing down right here to take it out. And it doesn't kind of, like, it works at weird angles. I mean, that is literally the diver's extension. And then in addition to that, you know, after you get it back on, it makes the clasp stinking huge. I mean, look how huge this is. One, this butterfly is already huge. Then you got this little thing right back down there. I mean, look how big that is. And then in addition to that, you got this all right here. It's just way, way too big. And you have to wear it on the side of your wrist because it wants to naturally turn into that side of your wrist. So Seiko needs to totally ditch this clasp, or at least the diver's extension part of it. And I get it, it's a dive watch, but either reinvent this clasp with the diver's extension being embedded into the watch, or some other feature, a quick adjustment, or just, you know, give people a rubber strap so that if they want to go diving with it, they use the rubber strap instead of this awful clasp system that they made. It's just so ugly. I hate it. Look, I know that in the grand scheme of things, it's probably not that big of a deal, but this is a watch channel, and I'm super passionate about watches, so that's my honest opinion about it. So overall, beautiful watch, great watch, perfect modern look with the nice vintage details. Like, you even get drilled lug holes. How cool is that? But I do think that Seiko should be offering just a little bit more for this price range. You know, thankfully, even though if you can't get this blue version, there's still the other versions available that look great. But that's my feedback for Seiko. I think Seiko needs to offer just a little bit more. Like, you know, if they can offer screwed-in links, or get a better clasp, or put in their 6L movement, then I think this watch would be screaming value for $1,300 or so. And definitely, I think that if you're on the fence with the Black Bay 58 in particular, that you should definitely consider looking at one of these Seiko watches, because I think for most people out there, they would be really, really satisfied with this, and saving, you know, over $2,000 in your bank account is also a really great thing to be able to do. So let me know what you think about my criticism. Do you also hate the clasp as much as I do? And out of Seiko's new releases this year in 2020, what has been your favorite Seiko diver watch that they've released? All right. Well, if you like this video, just a reminder, hit the thumbs up button on it, and you can subscribe to my channel if you like the content that I produce. I'll see you in the next one.